So I'm curious, Matt, what is trauma and how does it differ from PTSD specifically?
Best definition I've heard for trauma is a trauma is an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories, reducing capacity for adaptation. So basically what that means is if you have an event that's like an overwhelming event and it changes your nervous system response moving forward, that's traumatic. And what that traumatic event does is it changes how your brain functions, how your body functions, and it changes our ability to come up with new strategies for dealing with future nervous system overwhelm, future stress events, future stuff that is uncomfortable, that sucks. Traumas, if you will, but really any stressful event is now going to be almost kind of like characterized or understood or processed in a new way that it would not be processed had that event not happened.
Can anything be trauma? You know, like if my parents yelled at me as a kid, I mean, is that trauma? Obviously, you know, accidents, stuff like that, that's trauma. You know, what's the difference? How would I know?
Yeah, it's really relative, right? And I think what a lot of times happens is we get hung up on like, I want this very narrow definition for trauma and to know, was this a traumatic event and was it not? I don't know, it kind of in my experience, I don't know how helpful that is, right? To like really parse out like, that was a trauma, that wasn't. If the event overwhelmed us and changed the way that my nervous system responds, that's going to change how my nervous system responds moving forward. I can understand that event differently now than I did then, and that will change the way that my nervous system responds in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's kind of liberating in a way,
Very
right?
much so. Yeah.
It's really dependent on you. Like, what impacted you?
Yes, how it impacted you and how you relate to that event. Were you a victim of that event or were you a survivor of that event?
Gotcha.
Right? And that's kind of what we do when we do trauma work, so to speak. And then PTSD is the more or less the diagnosis that is given to people when the traumatic events have accumulated to such an extent that it's now creating some debilitating issues in someone's life.
So someone with trauma might not necessarily have PTSD.
Right.
But everyone with PTSD would have trauma, right?
Nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Got
love
you.
that. That's awesome. So what is PTSD, Mitch?
That's a big question.
Here we go. We're going to dive in, guys.
Here's my definition, and I'll try not to butcher it. So PTSD is essentially when our brain and body produce this cycle of protective measures where we get stuck in this cycle because of the weight of our trauma. The weight of our trauma is too much for us to handle at the time.
Let me understand what that means, weight of our trauma. Break that down for me.
Yeah, so it's either cumulative or maybe the severity of the event. It could be both. But there's a certain tipping point. I like to think of it as a vessel, right? We're all born with a certain vessel on how much we can tolerate, how much pain and suffering. If we were to keep pouring liquid in, eventually it's going to overwhelm us, right?
I love that analogy.
And so, again, this is where PTSD comes in, is when that cup is finally overflowed.
Got it. So the cup overflows, and then what happens? How would I know, not necessarily that I have PTSD, but like that my cup is overflowing? What are the signs and symptoms, I guess?
Well, there's a bunch that we look at. As clinicians, we're looking at four main categories, really. The first ones are going to be intrusion symptoms, what we call intrusion symptoms, kind of hard to say. These can be things like intrusive memories, so unwanted, disturbing, involuntary memories that just flash into your mind, right? These could be images, sights, smells, where it kind of recalls you back to the memory. It could be things like nightmares. Many people with PTSD struggle with disturbing dreams of events, but they actually don't have to be about the event as well. It can be just weird, abstract flashbacks, which is a fancy word for basically reliving the moment in the present moment, or reliving the memory in the present moment.
It's like the past is happening now and you can't stop thinking about it, or you feel like it's happening to you in the moment when it really happened a long time ago.
It's like 1980 is now in 2024, or whenever that event happened.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and then obviously it impacts your brain and body. So the last symptom within that intrusive category would be what we call strong physiological or psychological reactions to triggers. So a fancy way of saying You're going to feel it in your body. You're going to feel anxious, tense, tight, and you're going to feel it in your mind. Your mind's going to be spinning, cluttered with thoughts, can't think straight, brain fog. It's all going to come up.
So those are the intrusive symptoms. And I would imagine then that conversely, there's other symptoms that are not intrusive.
The next category is avoidance. So
there you go.
Category number 2 is avoidance. This is where it's a pattern of behavior where we're actually avoiding two things, internal and external cues or reminders of the trauma.
So it's like I'm avoiding those intrusive symptoms with certain behaviors maybe?
Yeah.
Okay.
Drinking.
Drinking,
Right.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Drinking is a great way to numb. I'm not going to say great, but it's a common way that it is, right?
It
For a
works.
lot of guys, let's
Yeah.
just be honest.
It works
right?
until it doesn't, and then it gets real bad real fast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, drinking can be a great way to numb out the intense feelings that are coming in.
And I think it's important to point out that one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress injury or disorder or whatever you want to call it is doing stuff to avoid feeling.
Correct.
And if I'm doing stuff to avoid feeling, whatever, the reminders of the event or the physiological symptoms of the event or just to not feel in general, just numbing out, that's a very important messenger that the body's trying to signal to me like, hey man, this thing is really overwhelming. Let's not think about it. Let's avoid it.
It's a cry for help.
It is. And that chronic avoidance eventually down the line is going to lead to an exacerbation of all these symptoms, making them worse. Yeah.
These symptoms are your brain and body who are in a way stuck in the past saying, please, we can't keep doing this anymore. Remember the cycle of protective measures that I talked about, right?
Right.
They're continuing to protect us, but again, like you said, it works till it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so eventually you're going to burn yourself out and the symptoms become overwhelming and we start to suffer, right?
Next. What's the next symptom category?
Next symptom category would be negative, what's technically called negative alterations in cognition or mood. So basically changes in your mood, emotions, thoughts.
Cognitions are
Thoughts.
thinking.
Thinking.
I'm
correct.
noticing that all of a sudden I'm having these changes in the way I think, and I can't stop thinking about the way that I think.
Yeah.
And I'm stuck in this like loopy
loops.
thinking pattern is a really common one.
Remember,
Yeah.
cycle of protective measures, right?
Yeah.
So these thoughts, the thoughts like I'm bad, I'm not good enough, something's wrong with me, I'm messed up, I'm broken, right? I relate, right?
Oh,
I
definitely.
These negative thoughts are a way to warn us or to tell us, hey, something's not right.
Protective.
Protective.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So within negative changes in emotions, moods, thoughts, cognitions, and stuff like that, we're going to get trouble remembering parts of the trauma.
Yep.
We're going to get stuck in like some negative self-beliefs. We're going to get stuck in blame, strong, overwhelming emotions that I feel like I have a really hard time controlling that kind of come out of nowhere, like anger outbursts.
Yeah.
All of a sudden I'm yelling at my kids and I'm like watching myself yell at my kids or my wife and I'm red in the face and I'm like, I can't even stop doing this, right?
And then boom, flooded with shame,
And
right?
then all this shame just comes in and overwhelms the whole body.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to point out that all emotions are needed, right? Things like anger, even shame, sadness. These are all normal emotions, but again, what you're referring to, PTSD takes it to a whole nother level,
Right.
where it's impacting almost every single aspect
It's
of our
almost
life.
like my body's flaring up to such a degree that I just want to push everybody away from me because that protective nature is thinking that everybody around me is a threat.
Yes.
Even my sweet little daughter, which doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense. But when you start to realize what PTSD actually is and what the body's trying to do is keep me safe, these symptoms are designed to protect me at all costs.
At all costs, and it does that through the lens of our past. So I like to imagine PTSD as a pair of goggles that we put on, and these goggles are the lens of the past. Let's say you're a Vietnam veteran, and it's raining outside. 2024, here in Utah, it's raining. I walk outside, I'm a Vietnam veteran, and my activation level goes to a 10 out of 10. Why? Why do you think?
Because it's reminding me of rain in Vietnam.
Exactly, right? The death, destruction, gore that I saw back then, that's the lens in which I'm viewing the present rain. And so that rain is a threat.
Yeah. Interestingly, almost conversely, I have this extreme spike in emotionality on the opposite end of the spectrum. It can shut me down into nothing.
Yes.
Where I'm completely disconnected from my emotions, numbed out. But in reality, I mean, that's a common symptom as well. And that's what makes this whole like trauma treatment, PTSD thing tricky is because it is individualized and it is moment to moment. Because one moment I might be freaking the hell out,
Yep.
losing my mind in a situation where I wouldn't normally be, and in another moment where I should be losing my mind, and that freak out emotional reaction might make sense, I'm completely numb and detached
Completely
and
shut down.
disconnected. And both of those are inherently protective.
Yeah.
You see how that works.
And it's how our nervous system works, right? I mean,
Yes.
there's the states. I think an important area in this, or an important topic to talk about in this area is hyper versus hypoarousal.
Arousal, yes.
Right? A normal person's window, so this window of tolerance that we have, we're going to be able to tolerate those ups and downs of life without going into these extreme states.
Yeah.
What does PTSD do that at window?
Shrinks it.
Shrinks it, right?
Right.
It's not that the normal ups and downs of life have changed, but our ability to tolerate them has.
Yeah,
And
and
so,
that's that on the high end, that these last set of symptoms here, the reactivity symptoms,
Yep.
that's that hypervigilance, constantly on the lookout for any horrible bad thing that could happen.
Yep.
I had this guy I worked with who was like, I can't sit in a theater unless I'm at the very, very top and I have to bring my gun with me. This is one, that it gets a little dicey because it's like, well, I do want to protect myself here. But at what point is that inhibiting my ability to engage in the best parts of life?
Right.
And that's really why these reactivity symptoms seem to be kind of, I don't know if they're the most problematic, but maybe the most obvious when you take a step back and realize how much impact they're creating.
It's what our family members are going to see first,
Yes.
right?
Yes. What are the other reactivity symptoms?
Yeah,
that are-
so a common one is irritable behaviors,
Yeah.
angry outbursts. Again, going back to your example, right? Next thing you know, you've just blown up at your family and you're like, what the hell just happened?
Right.
Right? So irritable behavior, angry outbursts, hypervigilance like you're talking about, reckless behavior, self-destructive behavior.
Impulsivity, man.
Impulsivity.
Yeah.
Drinking,
Yeah,
driving a little recklessly,
Driving recklessly, yeah.
not taking meds when you're supposed to.
Dude, we had a guy who was like, dude, I just stopped wearing my vest.
Yeah.
I go to work, I'm going to put my vest on.
Yep,
I
reckless behavior.
Just, it's all right. If I get a bullet, it's okay.
Right.
That's an extreme example.
Right.
But there's also kind of like more mild examples of that, of just like, I'm going to take this turn really fast because it feels really good, or I want to be the first guy to every single pursuit because I love the pursuit.
Right.
There's variations of this. And it sounds like, oh, I'm freaking badass and I'm tough and stuff like that, which sure, you are, but at what cost?
Yep.
Do I realize the effect that that's having on the most important people in my life? Yeah, I want to help my homies out at work. At what cost? And that's a big question that you got to start asking yourself. We really everybody, we have to start asking ourselves as we look at our own lives and the symptoms or the signs or the evidence that maybe the past is catching up with me.
Yes, and there will come a point where it does catch up. I work with a lot of guys and gals who it worked, right? Their system of coping worked for 20 years, but eventually we hit a point, right, where that, again, going back to the cup overflows, can't contain it, and it's going to spill out in every area of our life.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and getting help sooner rather than later is definitely going to be paramount, right? Because the symptoms are only going to get more and more intense and more and more extreme over time.
Yep.
That's just the nature of this progressive, and we say disorder, but the nature of injury in general, right? Like if I ignore a wound on my body over time, the symptoms have to get worse because my body's trying to clue me in that I need to pay attention to this wound, to this injury.